Hello, I'm James Cooper, the director of the program on economics and privacy, which is a division of the Law and Economics Center at George Mason University School of Law. The program on economics and privacy is devoted to injecting sound economic analysis into policy discussions surrounding privacy, data security, and other pressing issues facing the digital economy. Welcome to another in a series of what I call PEP Talks, where I sit down and talk with leading academic researchers in the field of economics and privacy. My guest today is Alessandro Acquisti. For most of you watching, I'm sure that Alessandro really needs no introduction. He is the trustee professor of information and technology and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. His work is widely published in top journals, and he has more awards than I could begin to list here. It would exhaust all of our time. Alessandro is responsible for much of the most important foundational empirical research in the economics of privacy, and his research, as we'll hear more about, especially focuses on the role of behavioral economics and understanding how consumers value privacy. So Alessandro, welcome to this PEP Talk.
Hi, James. Great talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Great. I'm so glad you're here. Well, let's get started. First, just tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, how did you come to get interested in the economics and privacy? You know, what was the beginning of this long journey?
Right. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, I think. I am an economist by training, in the sense that I studied economics in Italy for my undergrad. And then I did a couple of masters in economics. I went to Trinity College, Dublin, then London School of Economics. And then I ended up in the United States, at Berkeley, for my PhD. And interestingly, perhaps, and intentionally, I didn't go to an econ department for my PhD, although up until then, my training had been purely in economics. I went to an information school. And the reason why I went to an information school were a couple of reasons. One was that I wanted to work with one particular person. And two, I really wanted to apply economics to information technology. And this particular person was the best person at the time I knew to do the kind of work. His name is Hal Varian. Hal Varian was, or at the time, already a very prominent, well-known economist focusing on economics of information. Also, was an author.
Yeah, right? I was going to say, Information Rules was a big book, Shapiro and Varian at the time. And I would just add that Hal Varian's micro textbook I had in my PhD program. So yes, it's an understatement to say that he was a pretty famous economist. So absolutely, a good choice.
Well, thank you. I was very lucky that I got there, and indeed we all studied on his textbooks. And I wanted to work with it. I wanted to work on economics of information. I wanted to be exposed to, for some reason, I already felt at the time that I wanted to do econ-grounded interdisciplinary work. I didn't know that I would work on privacy. At the time, in fact, I wanted to work on AI, economics of AI.
No, seriously, way ahead of your time, right?
Well, so yes and no. In that, when I was in Dublin, at Trinity College, I started working on economics of AI, which sounds strange to say because I was in Dublin between. I did the Erasmus program there, which is an exchange program for undergrads in the European Union. So I did there essentially the last year of my Italian undergrad. I started working my Italian dissertation. In Italy, the undergrad is a tesi di laurea, dissertation, which is taken very, very seriously. And I was working with Mario Baldassarri, another well-known economist, I proposed to him, I pitched to him after he had a wonderful class on macroeconomic models of exogenous growth and endogenous growth. You know, all the literature, Bob Solo, and then George Lucas, right? And he was talking to us about endogenous growth theory. And because I was at the time very much interested in computers, I proposed to him, hey, why don't I do a dissertation under your supervision about economics of AI? At the time, AI was completely different what AI is now. At the time, AI was expert systems, maybe in agent systems, intelligent agents, was not machine learning, which is what it is today. So I did this dissertation with him. When I was in Dublin, I kept working on these economics of artificial intelligence, how the idea was if you have capital, unlike traditional capital, depreciates over time, but instead it could appreciate over time in the sense that this capital can learn over time, can improve, right? How does that affect our economic models of endogenous growth? So when I went to Berkeley, initially I was thinking about continuing on that kind of research. But then I did this steering, right? From I remain within the field of econ of information, but I moved from AI to privacy. Why? I guess it was a combination of factors, really. I took a class with Professor Samuelson, a prominent law scholar at Berkeley, and she was also teaching at a high school, the information school at Berkeley. And she was teaching a class on essentially digital law for people like me who are not law scholars. And one class was about privacy, and it fascinated me. Also because I was noticing cultural differences between my European background and my perception of privacy and what I was seeing happening in the United States. For instance, I was living in a dorm called the I House, the International House, and I noticed one day that someone had entered my room, and apparently then I asked what happened, and someone from the staff had entered because they had to repair something. For me as a European, that was kind of like unthinkable. Can someone just enter the room that you're renting in a dorm without even asking permission beforehand? So there was this the different factors at the same time playing a role. I liked Professor Samuelson's class. I ended up doing the final project for a class on the economics of privacy. Hal Overian was interested in the topic. He had done a little paper in 1996, which probably we may end up talking again about later in our time together. And then, as almost any other grad student at the time, I started the company with 2 or 3 other international students, and the company was about privacy. The reason being that at the time in 1999, it seemed that that's when I started my PhD. It seemed that privacy was one of the big issues that had to be resolved in order for the internet to be successful. And together with a number of other grad students, we thought about, hey, can we try to develop a technology to allow people to buy online, but in a more privacy-preserving manner. So we came up with an algorithm. We patented it. We started a company. And then the company didn't go really anywhere because whenever we were pitching the idea to venture capitalists, in fact, angel investors, they were asking us who will pay for this. And they were very skeptical that consumers would pay for that. And at the time, they were probably right. And from this, eventually came up an interesting research question related to the so-called privacy paradox, why people claim that privacy is important to them, but on average, they are not willing to pay for it. So it was all a combination, all different factors that led me to get interested in privacy and economics.
Wow, that's fascinating. I did not know that you started off as an entrepreneur. That's quite. It's interesting too to think that the privacy paradox, goes all the way back to the early 2000s and kind of the kernel of that realization then. So let's fast forward a little bit. I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've clearly done a lot of the foundational work in this area. You clearly you're trained as an economist. I mean, as I think you said, you bring an economic discipline, or at least that's what you set out to do early in your career, and I believe you clearly accomplished that, bringing an economic discipline to studying these issues. How would you describe your body of work and some of its key findings?
Simple. Everything I do relates to privacy, which of course gives me a very vast umbrella because privacy is such a vast and admittedly ambiguous term, I summarize my research as focusing on three areas: what I call standard, traditional economics of privacy, behavior economics of privacy, and then privacy in online social networks. So economics of privacy is essentially theoretical work, or increasingly for me, empirical work, trying to understand trade-offs associated with protecting and sharing personal information. The trade-offs could be for the data subjects, the consumer, the individual, could be for companies, could be for society as a whole. And initially with HAL, indeed, we were working on traditional neoclassical microeconomic modeling.
I remember that paper.
2004 Marketing Science, right? It was one of the early pieces together with Curtis Taylor's work in Rand on this, price discrimination and privacy. And,
yes, exactly.
And although I still do some of that, because sometimes there are some research questions that can only be tackled through theoretical means, increasingly I've been doing empirical work, trying to estimate the cost of privacy regulation, as many of us have been doing, but also trying to get into benefits allocation of data, which is probably a topic we'll get to shortly. The second field is behavior economics of privacy, and that indeed came about because as I was initially working just on theoretical modeling, and then I started having to contend with this paradoxical anecdotal evidence from real world telling us that consumers like privacy, but apparently didn't want to really pay anything to protect it. That led me, once I moved to Carnegie Mellon University in 2003, led me to branch out into behavior economics and behavioral decision research. I started collaborating with behavior economists, trying to do lots of experiments about consumer decision-making evaluations of privacy. That in turn led me in 2004 to become interested in social media, because social media is essentially an incredible experiment in the wild of disclosure behavior and privacy behavior. I was lucky enough to teach a class on privacy in 2004, in the spring of 2004. A student, PhD student, Ralph Gross, told me about the existence of the Facebook.com, which I just started literally 2 months before Harvard. It just arrived at CMU. I told him, hey, why don't you do your course project about the Facebook.com? He did. And then that summer, we decided to start collaborating. We started creating an account on the Carnegie Mellon Facebook network. We started downloading publicly available data on that network. So we came up with the very first peer-reviewed, published academic article on Facebook in 2005. And then from there, we kept doing many other studies about all the crazy things that can happen once you reveal that information. Anything from predicting social security numbers from Facebook profile to real-time facial recognition in the wild, on the street, on campus, starting from a Facebook image to hiring discrimination in the US labor market based on information that employers may find about you on social media. So these are my three areas of research. And you asked about the key results. I guess we can get to that as we progress with our conversation.
Okay. Yeah. No. And it's interesting again to learn that, because I clearly a lot of your work is associated with behavioral economics, but interesting that you were not trained as a behavioral economist, which I'm learning new things about you, which I guess is great thing about this talk. Because you're so many of your most well-known papers and a lot of your well-known findings, I think, have to do with that. So that's interesting that you didn't necessarily start off as a behavioral economist or an experimental economist, but sort of morphed into that as you moved to Carnegie Mellon.
I pick it up along the way, right? So I was exposed to it, of course, during my PhD. For instance, I took classes, at least one class with Matt Rabin, of hyperbole discounting research, and so forth. But mainly my main focus during the PhD was definitely neoclassical economics. I was exposed to experimental behavioral work, but it was not my focus. But then, indeed, as I moved to CMU, I made a very intentional effort at learning new methodologies and interacting with others. For instance, George Lowenstein, one of the best behavioral economists we have nowadays in this field, and learning from them and conducting all sorts of experiments in the area.
Yeah. You know, as you mentioned, I mean, we can talk about some of your key findings as we go through the discussion. And maybe one ways to illuminate what you found is to ask you, you know, what do you see as one of the more important questions that is yet to be answered in the field of economics and privacy? I mean, clearly you've attempted to address many of them, and maybe you've answered some of them, but what do you see as some of the things that are yet to be resolved? And feel free to toot your own horn and talk about some of the things that you have discovered and some of what some of the key findings of your work along the way.
Thank you. Well, if we look first at the open issues, so the one that neither I or others, in my opinion, have as of yet successfully tackled, the answer for me is simple: is value allocation in the data economy. There are many claims being made about the benefits that all stakeholders accrue from the collection and analysis of data. And perhaps these claims are true, but if you start digging deeper, you start finding less and less robust empirical rigorous evidence that all different stakeholders are benefiting from the commerce in data, or in fact are benefiting in similar ways. So much of the economics of privacy has been focusing on the cost of privacy. We have this tendency in economics to look at the impact, the negative impact of privacy regulation on economic variables, from innovation to advertising effectiveness, and so on and so forth. There is this cottage industry that has grown up with a GDPR, of which, for full disclosure, I am part, because I also contributed my own GDPR empirical related paper. It's probably all the people you have been discussing with, I'm sure, all the people you are interviewing have done their GDPR piece. It's a rite of passage, right?
I think my son is working on one right now. I'm just kidding. He's not even through college. So, but still, you're right. The GDPR is a fantastic natural experiment, right. and there is a lot of very interesting research, yours included, right, coming out of that. Yeah,
right. It's and yeah, I agree. Probably we also agree that how fantastic nature experiment. You know, we probably agree that the fantastic part is you know, it's a tricky nature experiment, right? Because the start date, which start date do we choose? The one when it was enacted, when companies started preparing for it, and then what is the control condition? What is the treatment, right? So it's one of the situations where ex ante all of us thought, okay, this is amazing. And then when you start working on it, you start realizing, okay, this is really messy. This is really challenging from a methodological perspective, which didn't stop all of us to trying to, you know, throw our attempt at analyzing GDPR into the mix. In any case, where I was going with this is that I believe that first of all, it's amazing what is happening in 20 years in this field of research. It has been so exciting to see in 20 years the field going from just a few people and a few manuscripts to now so many articles, so many scholars, even traditional mainstream top economists who were not working on privacy. Now they are writing papers about the economics of data, the economics of privacy. This has been amazing. So I'm super happy, super excited about the field, but And I wrote this in a very recent NBAR piece that you were very kind to read and comment upon. I'm extremely thankful for that. The title of the piece is The Economics of Privacy at a Crossroads. We are recording this in July 2023. It will come out shortly with the NBAR. And as I point out there, if we look at this, we can be proud of what happened, but if we look at this critically, I feel that there has been a overweighted attention to the cost of privacy regulation, to the cost of privacy protection, and there are many reasons that could explain that. And there has been much less attention on super important questions, such as the value, the allocation of value. Because we focus on the cost of privacy and we assume that all this data is benefiting everyone. Is it really? If you look, for instance, at the field of online behavioral advertising, which is not the only way in which consumer data is analyzed, not the only vector for which consumer data is being collected, but if you look at the literature in that area, and you try to see how different stakeholders are benefiting from behavioral advertising, you realize that there is very uneven attention to different stakeholders. We know a lot about merchants, the advertisers. We know that behavioral targeting increases advertising effectiveness, increases conversion rate and click-through rates. We know much less about publishers. There is debate, I contributed to the debate, others have too, about how much publishers benefit from behavior advertising. And there is even less, almost nothing about consumers, which sounds surprising for me to say. We don't know how consumers are affected by behavior advertising. No, I argue we don't. We know from higher click-through and conversion rates that behavioral targeted advertising reduces search costs. That we can say. But as you know, search costs are not the only factor, not the only variable in the consumer utility function. There are prices of good, how much you end up paying if you buy a good that had been targeted to you. There is the quality of the vendor. If you end up clicking on an ad that was behavior targeted to you and you buy from that vendor, on average, you end up buying from a vendor with a quality which is similar, higher or lower than a vendor that you would have found selling the same product, but you would have found that vendor for search results. So there are these open questions which have not been addressed. And I feel, in a nutshell, that the big challenge facing us in the field is to be a little more willing to challenge the conventional wisdom about where does the value extracted from consumer data go. There is no doubt that there is value extracted. Where is it going, really?
Yeah. So, I mean, is that, man, it's a very interesting, and by the way, thank you for letting me look at your, review your paper, and I'm looking forward to it coming out. It is fascinating, and it's I could not agree more wholeheartedly. When I started being interested in this field, really as a consumer at the Federal Trade Commission back in the early to mid 2000s, and started to become acquainted with some of your work and Catherine Tucker's work, and so it is amazing to see how far the field has come since then. Completely. One thing when I think about the value, and it's interesting, you're right, maybe in some ways we economists are guilty of the old adage, you look for the keys under the lamppost, right? Because you have price metrics, it's easy to see what is the difference between a context ad, what is the CPM for a context ad versus a behaviorally targeted ad. Those are, at least if you have the right data set, those are easier to measure. I mean, clearly there's a lot of, you've got to take care of selection effects and all of that. What about the bigger picture? And maybe this isn't the time to address that, but then there's sort of the bigger picture value that, leaving aside, as you've said, value is being created, leaving aside how the pie gets divided. I think another question, and I don't think I have the answer to this, but to what extent is the value from data actually leading to all the free content, right, or a richer set of content? And maybe it, I know that's a big debate as well. Is what is the but-for world without data-driven advertising content-wise? I mean, some people are saying, well, the internet did just fine pre behavioral targeting and contextual ads provide enough revenue to get the amount of content that is optimal. Maybe the marginal content is truly that. Maybe it's marginal and low value. I know we're not going to answer that question, and it's one that I often think about, and I just wonder if you've kind of grappled with that as well as you're thinking through the division of the pie, the extent to which the content, the pie, to the extent to which data has led to more or better content than we would otherwise have. And you don't have to answer that now if I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but
no, that's a great question. Thank you, James. And indeed, it's another super important topic. So I would say that also for this particular angle, right? This value of data extraction in the form of free services and free content. Also there, I believe that we want to do better as a professional. And what do I mean by this? Again, I feel that we may have been a little too quick at accepting the conventional wisdom of a causal relationship between data collection, targeting, and free content and free services, whereas there may be, to some degree, a correlational relationship rather than causal. So this seems kind of crazy of me to say, but let me disentangle. So I was talking about the consumer impact, the impact of consumer welfare of behavioral targeting, and the example I was making earlier was an example of direct effects, such as you see a targeted ad, probably decreases your search costs, but may increase the price you pay and decrease the quality of the vendor you buy from. And this is at least the preliminary results of studies we have conducted at CMU. For full disclosure, we presented them at the FTC last fall, PrivacyCon, but they are not published yet. Okay, so big caveat. But then there is the indirect effect. The indirect effect is indeed this story, which is plausible on theoretical terms, where consumers benefit indirectly because the behavior advertising, collection of the data, increases the value of ads. And what does it mean? It means that merchants tend to be the higher amounts, and in turn, the publishers get higher revenues. And because they get higher revenues, they're able to support more and better quality content. Okay, so this is the theoretical argument. Now, we can tackle this and see whether it's true from two different directions. We can try to look at the micro, at the level of the revenues, whether in fact publishers' revenues are increasing, and because of behavior targeting. And the answer is we don't know. Which sounds again me being super bold and aggressive. So let me explain. There have been some studies, including my own, that have shown that there is a statistically significant increase at the per impression level of publishers' revenues when they sell behaviorally targeted advertising space compared to when they don't. Now, the magnitude of this increase is debated in the literature, right? You have results such as Google suggesting more than 50%. In fact, I think I remember in the little study they did a few years ago, I think they estimated between 50 to 60%. We have our study, which is the outlier in the opposite direction, which is much lower, 4 to 8%, depending on conditions. We have the most recent analysis by the group by Professor Schiera and Klaus Miller at HOC Paris. Their most recent estimate is 18%, which is closer to ours than to Google. But in general, although there is debate on the magnitude, there is agreement that there is an increase. Okay? Now, the magnitude is important because if it's an 18% increase, it's not really, that's pretty far from what Google claims, which is a 50, 60% increase. But regardless of our discussion about magnitude, I argue, and I do so in the NBERPs, I was boosting, I was publicizing advertising a few minutes ago. I argued that all these studies, including mine, miss the forest for the tree because they look at per impression revenue changes. And they are ignoring what happens across impressions. So they aggregate macro, so to say, impact of behavior advertising on publishers' revenue. Because behavior advertising at the per impression level may even increase per impression revenues, but in fact is also simultaneously in parallel creating potentially downward pressure on traditional publishers' revenues. Why? Because you have this two-sided market, right, where you have these matchmakers, the intermediaries in the middle, and you have publishers and consumers on one side, you have merchants on the other side. The story that the advertising industry likes to push forward is a story of reduction in search cost. These matchmakers in the middle are, by virtue of all the information they have about both sides of the market, they are reducing search costs for merchants to find consumers, for consumers to find merchants. In so doing, they benefit everyone, bids go up, revenues per impression for publishers go up, everyone is happy. That's the win-win story. But there is a parallel story, which on theoretical grounds is equally legitimate, which is a competition story. Behavior advertising has moved the matchmaking ability to connect merchants and consumers, has moved it away from publishers and it's put it in the hands of the intermediaries, right? Because before, if you were a merchant producing golf balls and you wanted to target precisely a golf interested consumer, you probably had to buy ads on the golf pages of the New York Times or on a golf magazine. Now you completely bypass that. You go to Google and you tell Google, hey, I want to find the people who are interested in golf. So there has been a technological switch, which also creates a significant economic change in the balance of power, moves economic power and data away from the size of the markets, move it towards the center. In this new world, publishers are very aggressively competing with each other because now New York Times is not just competing with Washington Post and USA Today and Post Gazette in Pittsburgh. It's competing with this endless list of information and content provision vectors, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and so on and so forth. There is this very aggressive competition among publishers. There is hyper aggressive competition among merchants because now I could try to target you because I'm a golf merchant and I know that you like golf. At the same time, someone in real-time bidding maybe try to bid for your eyeballs because they also know that you're also interested in Italian shirts and you're interested in a vacation to a skiing vacation in Utah, and so on and so forth. So there is this very intense competition, but in the middle you have an oligopoly because the online advertising ecosystem is vast, it's complex, no doubt about that. There are many players, but essentially it's dominated by few very large players, the matchmakers. So under this alternative theoretical depiction of the market, now you don't have just a search cost reduction story. You have a surplus extraction story where the matchmakers, those in the middle, are extracting surplus from the two sides of the market. And under this story, you realize that publishers' revenue in the aggregate, although nominally at the per impression level, it seems they are making more per impression due to behavioral targeting, across impression are making less because they are competing for consumer attention now with all these other new content providers, which precisely behavior advertising has made possible. Now, a counterpoint would be, but oh, okay, great. So behavior advertising has allowed more content to be provided to consumers, and that's possible. Although we may want then to have a discussion, which probably is a discussion for another interview about the quality of that new content being created. So the point being, on theoretical grounds as well as on empirical grounds, we really don't know how publishers are, especially legacy publishers, are being affected. Which brings me back to the point of, do we have another way to tackle the question of is free, the increase in the quantity or quality of free content or services, can they be tied causally to more data collection? Well, it's very difficult to test that. The only way we as economists have found a way to test it is indirectly, by indeed looking at the impact of regulations such as GDPR or exogenous shock such as Apple ATT. And so indirectly, we can try to study that. We look at, okay, here there is a shock, which in theory is decreasing the amount of information available in the market. therefore, in theory, is increasing the ability to behaviorally target ads. Can we see whether, when that happens, there is a decrease in the provision of content? And the answer is, well, yes and no, because you have studies such as Jensen et al. Titled The Lost Generation of Innovative Apps, which suggests that following the GDPR, there was a significant drop in the provision of app due specifically, causally linked to the GDPR. And then you have studies such as ours, in which we find that GDPR did not negatively affect news and media European websites' ability to provide quality content compared to US sites. And we also did a study on ATT, Apple ATT, again, finding no downstream negative impact on the provision of apps, on the supply of apps on the iOS Apple ecosystem compared to the Android ecosystem. We find an immediate negative reaction, which is absorbed very, very quickly after a few months. Which brings me back to my point. So maybe there is a causal relationship, but if I don't think we can say that we have established that rigorously, robustly, and therefore we cannot conclude that there is a causal versus a correlational relationship. Going back to my point, I think that this is due to the fact that we still don't understand very well, to the extent that value is created from data, whether most of the value is being clustered and kind of accrued by the intermediaries versus how much of that is actually going back to consumers in forms of goods, or to the publishers, or to other stakeholders.
I mean, that's fascinating, to think about how the distribution of the rents is perhaps influencing the value that's ultimately created by the system, and how the intermediaries, the platforms, I guess, their job, at least in theory, is to manage all that and to make the pie grow. But I think it is a very interesting question, and certainly one that, as I look at the field, is yet to be answered concretely either. I mean, I think since we're all plugging our work, I actually have a working paper with Garrett Johnson and Tesseri Lin from Boston University, using an exogenous shock, which is the FTC's settlement with YouTube, which prevented YouTube from using targeted ads for child-directed advertising. So it's kind of, it's a little cleaner than the GDPR, and we have a decent control group. We find at least, some pretty robust supply side effects, but again, it's a working paper. It's on SSRN. There's my plug. Take a look at it. But I agree. I think you've got different data points all over, and I think this is one of the biggest. There's sort of the conventional wisdom that it's clearly more higher valued ads per impression means more content. That's kind of the conventional wisdom, but I think it's you're right. Let's unpack that and think about it a little more deeply. And I guess we'll stay tuned and see where the empirical work takes us. But perhaps I was going to move to my next question, but perhaps we've already we've answered some of it. But I was, what are you working on now, Alessandro? Now, I say that having known and been familiar with your work for quite some time. You're usually working on about 30 different things. It seems every paper I read in this field is you're a co-author on it. So we could probably spend another hour talking about what you're working on. But what is, if you just want to highlight, one thing that you're working on right now that's really got your attention.
Sure. Very kind of you to ask. I'm extremely interested in understanding better the economic impact of privacy technologies, and in particular, what I like calling privacy-preserving analytics, because perhaps privacy-preserving analytics, and I will explain in a second what I mean by that, could be a way to almost bypass all of this discussion by showing that, hey, perhaps we can have the cake and eat it too. We can have privacy and we can have value from data. We can extract the surplus, and we can still protect individuals. So privacy-preserving analytics is a term I use to refer to a number of tools, frameworks, systems, technologies, from differential privacy to homomorphic encryption to federated learning, k-anonymity, and so on and so forth, which have been deployed or developed in the last 10, 15, 20 years to attempt to either de-identify data or to allow data to be shared while individual data points are being quote unquote protected. There are a number of different variations of these tools and frameworks, but in general, while there has been lots of really great theoretical research on those tools, especially from statisticians and computer scientists, there is still, relatively speaking, a paucity of social science research on the downstream impacts that these tools once deployed actually have on trade-offs for different stakeholders. So I've been working with Ryan Steed, who is a CMU student here at CMU, and other collaborators on trying to understand better the impact of a particular tool, differential privacy, used in a particular context, US Census. And we just published a few months ago a study in Science on the impact that the deployment of differential privacy may have on census data, showing that yes, there can be some downstream effects in terms of how the census data used for allocation of funding under Title I, essentially educational funding to different districts, educational districts in the US, how differential privacy can affect it. But it turns out it affects that minimally compared to the impact on those allocations of funding that other things such as data errors and data noise can have. So the attacks that differential privacy has been receiving from a number of directions may be simultaneously factually true and a little unfair, because again, they may be missing perhaps the forest for the tree. And that's just an example of a line of research that I am focusing on, which is this estimation, let's call it that way, or investigation of the downstream impact of privacy-preserving analytics. While I don't look at privacy-preserving analytics and privacy technologies necessarily as a solution to all privacy problems, they are no panacea. They nevertheless can be useful in certain scenarios, and I feel that it's a very important, rich, new, and very important policy-wise area of investigation for us.
Yeah. Well, that sounds interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing. I'll look forward to taking a look at your piece of science and staying tuned. So we're getting up against our time here, Alessandro, and so I want to ask you one more question. With your vast body of research and your knowledge in this field, if you could, and I say this because I know that you have talked to people at the FTC and Congress before, so in a way this isn't necessarily a hypothetical, but if you could give one piece of advice to policymakers that are currently working in privacy, what would it be?
That there is wisdom in tackling privacy as a fundamental human right. And I say this as an economist, right? Why? Because essentially the claim I make in the piece I mentioned now a few times, the NBR piece, is that the evidence coming from the economics of privacy is so nuanced, is so mixed. In some cases, there are so many holes in our understanding of the trade-offs of privacy that if you stop for a moment and step back and look at the overall body of evidence, you realize that, you know what, perhaps we should actually be careful about messing too much with privacy and thinking that, okay, because we think that behavior advertising increases advertising effectiveness by 5%, and if we enact this regulation, we reduce advertising effectiveness by 7%. Well, if we take that line of argument too far, we may be really, again, missing the forest for the tree, missing the importance that privacy has in our societies, which are which is an importance, which is not probably measurable only on economic grounds and economic terms. We are pretty good at finding the cost, right, of privacy. We're pretty good, as you were mentioning earlier, capturing these variables that look at these particular metrics, looking at the keys because searching the keys under the street lamp because there is light there. But when it comes to privacy, that's a very risky behavior for us economists because we are literally missing the richness of the importance of privacy in a society. And therefore, for the policymakers, look at the bigger picture. Maybe there is a reason why many societies look at privacy not just as trade-offs related to data, but as a value.
Oh, well, thank you, Alessandro. That's a lot to think about. And especially coming from someone like you, who's trained as an economist, but to kind of say, let's maybe put the economics aside and think about the big picture. So
not just aside, but looking. I don't want to dismiss economics at all.
Yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Yeah,
it's using economics as a complement and not as a substitute.
Oh, nice way to bring it full circle. Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, Alessandro, I want to thank you so much. This has been a fantastic and enlightening conversation for me. I'm sure we could go on another hour, but I want to thank you so much for your time. So my guest today has been Alessandro Acquisti. Thank you again, Alessandro.
Thank you, James. Always a pleasure and lots of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.